He thought he had power, until he found out who the woman he had humiliated on the road was. She didn't scream, she didn't defend herself, but her testimony destroyed his career in an instant. Post in the comments, where are you watching from? It was well past midnight on a deserted stretch of highway, a night so silent that every subtle sound seemed amplified in the cool air. The road, slick from a recent rain, curved and twisted beneath the ghostly glow of sparse streetlights. In his patrol cruiser, Sergeant Michael Reynolds prowled with an air of self-importance. Clad in a crisply pressed uniform and a badge polished to a mirror finish, Reynolds carried with him an unwavering conviction in his own authority. To him, that gleaming token on his chest was more than just a symbol. It was his shield against reproach, a guarantee of untouchability. In his mind, his badge gave him the power to intimidate and control every encounter on his beat. Tonight, as the silence of the road was broken only by the rhythmic hum of his cruiser's engine, Reynolds caught sight of a modest sedan weaving cautiously along the shoulder. Its driver, a middle-aged woman with steady, unflappable eyes, maintained a calm demeanor despite the late hour. Unbeknownst to the arrogant sergeant, this woman was no ordinary civilian. Though she appeared unremarkable at first glance, a simple driver on a routine journey, she carried with her a storied past as a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army, a decorated veteran whose experiences in the crucible of combat had steeled her against intimidation of all kinds. Believing he had identified just another civil case to add to his night's work, Reynolds activated his siren with a theatrical flourish, announcing his presence in a cascade of piercing sound. He maneuvered his cruiser alongside the sedan, his headlights briefly washing over the vehicle in a stark, accusing glare. With practiced precision, he pulled up behind the car so that the driver could see his reflection in the rearview mirror, a mirror that seemed to project an image of authority and dominance. He then stepped out of his vehicle, the sound of his boots echoing on the wet asphalt as he approached the driver's side door with deliberate swagger. "License and registration," he barked, his tone dripping with condescension. Every word, every gesture, was meant to assert his superiority and instill fear. Reynolds believed that in moments like these, his badge did most of the talking, enough to humble any civilian daring to defy him. The woman, however, did not flinch. With a measured calmness that belied the situation, she slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. As Reynolds leaned through the slightly frosted window, her fatigue-free eyes met his with quiet resolve, the unspoken message clear. She would abide by every procedure he demanded, yet nothing about her expression suggested the subservience he expected. As the sergeant circled the vehicle, his gaze swept over the woman with a mixture of disdain and entitlement. His hand rested confidently on the radio transmitter in his pocket while he produced a notepad from which he was to write his report later. Yet, even with all his brazen facade, he missed one critical detail. She had discreetly taken out her smartphone from a leather purse and was quietly recording the entire exchange. Her lips remained sealed in a neutral expression, and she never raised her voice or responded with anger. Instead, every move she made conveyed meticulous alertness and an unwavering adherence to protocol, as though she had rehearsed moments like these in the high-pressure environments of battlefields long past. "Don't try to act smart with me," Sergeant Reynolds snapped, his voice carrying into the still night. "I'm not in the habit of tolerating nonsense from civilians out here." He prodded further with a string of empty threats, convinced that his aggressive tactics would force an admission of guilt or mistake. He even went so far as to brandish his badge with an imperious flourish, as if the shimmering metal could erase any hint of insubordination. "You're going to get a ticket, or worse, if I have to escalate this," he warned, his tone laced with derision. The woman, maintaining her silence, simply tilted her head slightly and, meeting his gaze steadily, responded in a measured, almost serene tone. "Officer, may I ask for your name, rank, and badge number?" Her question, a request for the facts as laid out in protocol, took him aback. For a split second, his arrogant facade trembled under the weight of her unexpected calm. Reynolds was not accustomed to being challenged in any form, especially not by someone who seemed too composed to be bothered by a standard roadside check. In that moment, he realized something unsettling. Her silence was not weakness. It was preparedness. And the cool precision in her voice, devoid of any overt confrontation, was a far cry from the usual cowering compliance of someone he deemed inferior. As Reynolds fumbled for a response, her smartphone continued to record every micro-expression, every nuance of his disintegrating bravado. Unconsciously, the sergeant's threats faltered, and his scripted lines began to lose the force they had carried mere moments before. In the cold glare of the streetlight, the man who prided himself on his untouchable status suddenly appeared small and uncertain, a stark contrast to the imposing figure he believed himself to be. That one exchange, brief yet potent, set the stage for a ripple effect that would eventually lead to a courtroom battle he could never have anticipated. Without a word beyond the necessary protocol, the woman collected every detail of the encounter in quiet diligence, her calm demeanor belying the storm of consequences that lay ahead. Unknown to Sergeant Reynolds, he had just initiated an incident that would, in time, dismantle his career, strip him of his self-assumed impunity, and expose the perils of unchecked arrogance, even when one believes that the glint of a badge makes them invincible. He thought his token made him untouchable. Tonight, however, the wrong woman had stepped into his life, and in her silence and steadfast adherence to duty, she had begun to gather the evidence that would one day bring him unceremoniously into the light of justice. The tense atmosphere that had begun on that quiet, rain-slicked road deepened into an uncomfortable standoff. Under the relentless beam of his cruiser's searchlight, Sergeant Reynolds circled the sedan like a predator. His words, coarse and laced with disdain, continued to puncture the night's stillness. "I don't care what your excuses are," he snarled, his voice dripping with derision. "You're violating regulations by not pulling over properly. And don't think I'm going to let you off easy tonight." The woman, sitting firmly behind the wheel, maintained an unervingly composed silence. While Reynolds barked orders and threats, her eyes remained fixed steadily on the road ahead. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with measured restraint, and her posture was as upright and resolute as though she had faced far worse adversaries than a brash roadside cop. At the same time, she had already taken out her smartphone from a neatly tucked leather purse. In the dim illumination of the patrol car's lights, the device's screen glowed faintly as it began recording the entire encounter. The sergeant's every word, every snap of his voice, as well as the subtle shifts of her composure and the background murmur of the night. Sergeant Reynolds paced around the vehicle, unconcerned with decorum, allowing his ego to guide each degrading remark. "I have no time for liars or troublemakers," he shouted over the sound of the patrolling engine. "If you try to pull some stunt on me tonight, you'll regret it. I'm talking arrest, citation. Anything you do. I have the power to make your life a living hell." His threats escalated in volume and venom, each declaration meant to instill fear and assert his unchallenged dominance on the road. In his mind, the glint of his badge and the weight of his years on the force rendered him invincible, a man untouchable by the frailties of the ordinary. Amid this barrage of aggression, the woman's response was a study in silent resilience. Without raising her voice or engaging in his vitriol, she continued to record. The camera lens silently captured every rough gesture, every sneer, every moment when Reynolds' bravado faltered for just an instant, a moment when his eyes flickered with uncertainty as she asked for his credentials. At one point, when Reynolds' tone grew particularly belligerent and he leaned in too close, he blurted out, "Why don't you tell me who you are?" In that split second, she met his gaze with a calm that contrasted starkly with his fury. "Officer," she said, her tone measured and even, "may I have your name, rank, and badge number, please?" It was a simple request, which in any other setting would have been routine procedure. But that night, it struck him like an unexpected defiance, a reply that compelled him to pause. Caught off guard by her unwavering composure and the unspoken assertion hidden within her request, Reynolds stuttered. His eyes darted from her face to the dashboard of his cruiser, trying to reassemble his thoughts amid the recording he hardly realized was capturing his faltering confidence. For a few agonizing seconds, the sergeant's usual smirk wavered. His posture, once imposing and upright, seemed to sag as he realized that the woman before him was not as easily cowed or dismissed as he had presumed. His voice, once booming and unchallenged, came out haltingly. I am Sergeant Michael Reynolds, badge number 0467, he muttered, his tone now betraying a hint of vulnerability. Still, even as he gave up his details, his hand moved to produce a crumpled ticket form, his intent unmistakable, to record a fabricated citation forged not in truth but in his own twisted sense of justice. Without breaking her serene silence, the woman continued to observe, every pixel of the encounter diligently logged by her smartphone. As Reynolds scribbled furiously on his notepad, a futile attempt to assert narrative control over the situation, the woman finally allowed herself to speak in a voice that remained soft and unyielding. I understand that you believe your authority is absolute, she said calmly, but I will follow the proper channels if necessary. The statement was not loud enough to provoke further outbursts, yet it carried an undercurrent of resolve that hinted at depths of experience and authority far beyond that of a simple civilian driver. The words, though sparse, resonated in a way that belied her outward quiet. They were the quiet prelude to an inevitability that Reynolds was not prepared for. Meanwhile, unknown to him, every moment was being documented. The raw anger in his tone, the authoritative threat in each of his gestures, and the sharp contrast against her calm indifference. The recording, set expertly on timestamp mode, captured the entirety of the encounter. This digital log would soon become an invaluable piece of evidence, not for the misdemeanor he believed he was committing, but for a far more significant accountability that would question the misuse of power. As the minutes ticked by, Reynolds, still caught in his own web of posturing, began the process of finalizing his routine report. He called the woman out one final time. "You'd better watch yourself," he snarled, "or I'll have you arrested for obstructing justice." His words, aggressive and frosty, hung in the air. In response, the woman remained silent, a smile of quiet determination playing on her lips that Reynolds failed to see or comprehend. It was only when the sergeant superior's voice crackled over the radio, demanding that the evening's traffic stop be concluded, that he reluctantly returned to his cruiser and drove off, leaving behind a scene imbued with unresolved tension and a recording that would soon upend his world. Later, as the night gave way to the cold light of dawn, the woman reviewed her recording on her smartphone. What she saw was a detailed account of behavior that had crossed the boundaries of professional conduct. At the conclusion of the encounter, with the roadside drama now captured in its entirety, she prepared to complete the standard procedure required by her own protocols. When the appropriate time came, after the incident had been reported to the appropriate channels and shortly before she departed the scene to file her own detailed report, she calmly stated her status. I am Lieutenant Sarah Collins, retired from the U.S. Army, and a current civilian under federal protection. Her statement, uttered softly into a recording device as part of her debriefing note, was intended not as a confrontation but as a factual assertion to ensure that the narrative was not distorted by the sergeant's earlier threats. By the time the morning shift began and the scene was re-examined as part of a larger inquiry, there was clear evidence that what had transpired was more than a mere roadside stop gone awry. What had begun as a humiliating, unchecked abuse of power on a dark highway had been documented with crystalline clarity. A documentation that would soon force those in higher command to confront the reality that a badge did not make one untouchable. For Lieutenant Collins's measured calmness and disciplined accuracy had become an enduring counterpoint to the haughty bravado of Sergeant Reynolds, setting in motion a chain of events that promised to bring accountability where it was long overdue. When dawn broke over the quiet highway the next morning, the echoes of the previous night's encounter had barely begun to fade from the still warm memories of those involved. In the precinct, Sergeant Michael Reynolds was already nursing a bruised ego as he processed yesterday's events in his cluttered office. Despite his earlier display of uninhibited bravado, the mounting evidence silently amassed against him was now coming to light. Unbeknownst to him, Lieutenant Sarah Collins's methodical recording from that fateful roadside stop had been submitted through official channels before sunrise. With every detail captured in crisp audio and video, her evidence transformed what Reynolds assumed was a routine traffic stop into an incident that would soon rewrite the story of his career. Within hours of the shift change, Lieutenant Collins presented her polished debriefing report to the on-duty supervisors. Her report was dispassionate, clinical, and replete with meticulous notes. The exact time of the stop, a detailed transcript of Sergeant Reynolds's threats, even a time-stamped recording of his self-identification and the subsequent humiliation as his earlier threats gave way to reluctant acknowledgement. Her calm declaration, "I am Lieutenant Sarah Collins, retired from the U.S. Army and a current civilian under federal protection," was noted not as an act of defiance, but as an obligation to record the facts accurately. The report included annotated screenshots from her smartphone, each image showing Reynolds's aggressive gestures, along with a high-resolution copy of his handwritten ticket that he had tried to fabricate on the spot. Before the day was out, the evidence was handed over to the local Internal Affairs Division. Simultaneously, an official inquiry was sparked by the unexpected connection. A request emanating from the Pentagon itself, sent to the regional command, demanding a review of the incident. The memorandum, curt and devoid of sentiment, stated that an officer's misuse of authority, particularly in interactions with civilians who have distinct backgrounds and professional experiences, was of utmost concern. Within the report, the sergeant's badge number, the timestamp on the recording, and even the geolocation data from the smartphone were cataloged. It was clear that the chain of evidence was robust, and it would soon force a confrontation with the unwritten rules of the force. As a new day unfolded, the precinct buzzed with whispers. Officers who had long taken pride in their unchecked power now found themselves under the unyielding glare of accountability. In a tightly closed meeting behind locked doors, senior officers huddled around a cluttered conference table. The internal review began with an air of cautious determination, as the newly submitted evidence from Lieutenant Collins was examined line by line. One by one, they watched her recording, noting how Reynolds's voice, once so loud and imperious in the darkness, now faltered when his own credentials were questioned. His recorded statement, "I'm Sergeant Michael Reynolds, badge number 0467, now took on an ironic timbre, contrasted sharply against the calm, measured tone of the woman who had captured every utterance. The transcripts and digital files were forwarded up the chain of command. It wasn't long before the military inspectorate, in collaboration with local internal affairs, set up an official inquiry. The inquiry aimed to determine whether Reynolds had overstepped not only departmental regulations but also the civil rights of the individual involved. Officers in reception halls reviewed printed copies of the report while others scrambled to retrieve additional footage from nearby patrol cameras that might have recorded changes in Reynolds's demeanor or interactions with other civilians in previous incidents. Murmurs in the newsroom of the local dispatch indicated that the story was already beginning to ripple out into the broader community. What had been an isolated act of purported authority was rapidly morphing into a symbol of the systemic abuse of power. In an interim memo sent to all officers in the unit, the precinct commander reminded everyone that no officer is above scrutiny, and that all interactions with the public should adhere to the high standards of conduct expected by both departmental policy and federal oversight. The memo cited the growing trend of digital evidence being used to hold law enforcement to account, a trend that several younger officers had welcomed as a corrective force against tyranny. For the seasoned veteran like Reynolds, however, it was an ominous harbinger of change he hadn't anticipated. His colleagues whispered about his potential disciplinary actions, speculating that his days of unchecked authority might be numbered. Throughout the morning, as the evidence was reviewed, Lieutenant Collins received several discreet messages from federal agents. They confirmed that a formal inquiry had been initiated, and an official request for information from the Pentagon had been logged into the system. The local media, quick to pick up on any hint of scandal, began to send reporters to the precinct. Within hours, the incident was no longer classified merely as an internal matter. It was now under the watchful eyes of federal and public scrutiny, a development that would not allow any officer to hide behind a badge. The recording was unassailable. Not only did it capture the aggressive tone and unprofessional language, but it also included the precise moment when Lieutenant Collins, with a quiet yet piercing inquiry, undermined Reynolds's authority by asking for his credentials. The calculated calm in her voice contrasted deeply with his escalating threats. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. What began as an expression of arrogance was now undeniable proof that even the most self-assured assertions of strength could crumble under the weight of indisputable facts. Sergeant Reynolds was soon placed under formal investigation. His supervisor scheduled a meeting for later that afternoon, and whispers of internal review spread like wildfire among the ranks. Reynolds himself, seated alone in his office filled with personal memorabilia and commendations from previous shifts, could feel the pressure mounting. Every accolade he had cherished now felt like a fragile facade, one that was about to be dismantled piece by piece. He rifled through files on his desk as though searching for justification or a miracle that might salvage his tarnished reputation. Yet, deep down, he knew that the recording, with its unyielding truth, would be his undoing. Within the precinct, officers quietly exchanged glances, aware that a pivotal moment was unfolding, a moment that would no longer allow the unchecked power normally sheltered by a badge and a token of authority. Somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of the law, the chain reaction had already begun. As documents were filed, evidence was scrutinized, and inquiries were detailed in official memos, the legacy of that late-night encounter was set in motion. The sergeant, once convinced of his invincibility, was on the precipice of a reckoning his earlier arrogance had never anticipated. By mid-morning, as the precinct's corridors buzzed with hushed conversations and furtive glances, a palpable divide had taken hold of the police department. In the aftermath of Lieutenant Collins's evidence submission, and with the Pentagon's inquiry already underway, a storm of internal conflict had erupted. Senior officers and junior ranks alike found themselves caught in a turbulent crossfire between loyalty to long-established traditions and the inevitable demands for accountability. At the center of this internal maelstrom was Sergeant Michael Reynolds, whose pride and denial had made him a lightning rod for recrimination. It all began in a cramped conference room on the second floor of the precinct headquarters. The room, usually a place where officers reviewed routine reports or planned community outreach programs, had now been transformed into an impromptu battleground for voices demanding reform. The meeting was convened by the precinct commander, who, with the weight of responsibility etched deep into his features, opened the session with a stern reminder. No one is above scrutiny. We must all abide by the highest standards of conduct. His words, though measured, carried the unmistakable tone of a man who knew that the department's reputation, and the community's trust, was on the line. Within minutes, the room split into factions. Some younger officers, fresh into the force and buoyed by the digital age of transparency, spoke in low, determined voices about how unchecked power could no longer be tolerated. Every time an officer abuses his position, it chips away at our integrity, one officer remarked as he adjusted his tie, his eyes fixed on the door where Sergeant Reynolds was expected to appear. Others, men and women who had served for decades, exchanged worried glances. These seasoned officers, who had long operated under an unspoken code of respect for hierarchical authority, now found themselves questioning practices they had once taken for granted. Some even whispered that the recent digital evidence should force a full-scale review of past incidents. When Sergeant Reynolds was finally summoned into the meeting, he strode in with a defiant air, each step marked by the confident swagger of a man who believed his badge rendered him invincible. His uniform, spotless and dignified to his own eyes, was meant to reassure, but instead it only served to heighten the tension in the room. Sensing the storm that awaited him, Reynolds barely waited for formal introductions before launching into a vehement defense of his actions. These allegations are nothing but exaggerations born out of envy and an over-reliance on technology, Reynolds declared with a sneer, his voice resonating across the tense atmosphere. I performed my duty on that night just as any officer would. I followed protocol and yes, I took appropriate measures to secure the roadway. If anyone's conduct was improper, it is those who have now turned cameras and smartphones against us to manufacture stories. His words, dripping with a dismissive arrogance, only fueled the murmurs of dissent. A junior officer, one who had witnessed the incident firsthand, hesitantly interjected, Sergeant, the recording clearly shows a modicum of aggression that goes beyond standard procedure. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was personal. Reynolds's face flushed, and his eyes narrowed as he shot back, "Personal? I am enforcing the law. If you can't handle a late-night traffic stop, then perhaps you should rethink why you're here instead of criticizing a fellow officer." His retort, however, did little to quell the rising tide of discontent among the assembled officers. Rather than silencing his critics, it exposed deep fractures in the department's culture. A culture that, until now, had been dominated by unwavering deference to authority. Outside the confines of that meeting, word of the confrontation spread like wildfire. In the hallways and locker rooms, hushed conversations revolved around the notion that Reynolds's behavior was emblematic of a broader pattern of abuse and entitlement. "I've seen him treat routine stops like he's protecting his personal kingdom," one officer confided to a colleague in a tone barely audible over the buzz of the day's activities. "And now that his actions are under scrutiny, he's acting as if the truth doesn't matter." Others recalled previous incidents, quiet yet telling episodes where Reynolds had overstepped his bounds, dismissing civilian pleas and even ignoring minor infractions merely to assert his dominance. The deputy chief, a stern yet fair figure who had dedicated his career to upholding departmental honor, summoned Reynolds later that afternoon for a private meeting. In a cold, minimally furnished office adorned with plaques commemorating years of service, the deputy chief laid bare the growing dissatisfaction. "Sergeant Reynolds, your record up to this point was commendable," he began carefully. "But this incident, coupled with the evidence that has come into our possession, suggests a pattern. Our community expects us to be protectors, not oppressors. I can no longer allow you to dismiss these concerns with bravado and sarcasm." Reynolds, his jaw set in hard defiance, retorted sharply, "I have served this department for over 20 years with honor. These so-called concerns are the ramblings of idealists who have never had to make split-second decisions on dark roads. I stick to my methods because they work. The fact that you're now questioning my integrity only shows that the department's values are shifting in a direction that undermines authority." His words, though forceful, could not entirely mask the tremor of insecurity that flickered across his face. In that moment, he realized that his habitual dismissal of accountability might be coming back to haunt him. As the day wore on, internal lines of communication buzzed with memos and urgent emails. A faction of higher-ranking officers began drafting proposals for a comprehensive review of conduct standards, citing the Reynolds incident as a catalyst for change. Simultaneously, a contingent of loyalists defended his record, asserting that his long history of service should count for something. This internal tug-of-war heightened the stakes in the already fraught atmosphere, and the department's leadership found itself having to make a choice. Should they protect the established order, or welcome a new era of accountability enforced by modern technology and a refusal to tolerate arrogance? In parallel, at the precinct's monitoring center, the digital evidence captured by Lieutenant Collins was being collated alongside other recent complaints of forceful conduct against officers. The data pointed toward a disturbing trend, one that suggested Reynolds was perhaps not the only officer whose actions now warranted closer scrutiny. Yet, as the analysis deepened, it became increasingly clear that his case was particularly egregious. His behavior not only violated protocol but also struck a resounding blow to the very principles of public service that the department was sworn to uphold. By the end of the day, as whispers of an impending official disciplinary review rippled through the halls, Reynolds remained defiant. In a closing statement to his immediate subordinates, he proclaimed in a hushed tone meant to instill both loyalty and trepidation, "This isn't a witch hunt. It's a misunderstanding. They're trying to make me an example of something I'm not. I know what I did, and I'll stand by it." But behind his bravado lay the growing realization that the tide of accountability could not be repelled forever. Thus, amidst internal conflicts, bureaucratic power struggles, and an ever-watchful community, the legacy of that fateful night had shifted. The sergeant, once convinced that his badge made him untouchable, now faced not only the judgment of his peers, but the inevitable consequences of an unruly mix of old-school arrogance and modern accountability. The seeds of reform had been sown, and though Reynolds tried to cast aside every serious criticism with haughty dismissals, every word he uttered increasingly sealed his fate. The day of reckoning had finally arrived, a day that would expose the unchecked arrogance of Sergeant Michael Reynolds for all to see. The courtroom was a solemn arena of justice, its polished wood and imposing judge's bench a far cry from the rain-slicked highway where Reynolds had once shouted threats into the night. In this space, evidence was the true authority, and every recording, transcript, and witness testimony was destined to dismantle the false invincibility Reynolds so cherished. As the court session commenced, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. On one side of the courtroom sat Reynolds, resolute yet noticeably paler than his former bravado would suggest. His uniform, once his armor, looked dull under the harsh glare of the court's fluorescent lights. Across from him, a panel of stern-faced judges and an audience of fellow officers, concerned citizens, and members of the media filled the benches, all aware that today the scales of authority would be balanced by indisputable facts. Presiding over the case was Judge Amelia Foster, a woman known for her unyielding commitment to truth and decorum. With decades of legal experience and a reputation for fairness, she reminded everyone that zväny rank is not an indulgence. Power is not measured by the weight of a badge. Her opening remarks set the tone, emphasizing that no one, regardless of past achievements or years of service, was above the law. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out its case. The cornerstone of the evidence was the recording captured by Lieutenant Sarah Collins on that fateful night. With the help of modern audiovisual equipment, the court projected the recording onto a large screen so that every word, every gesture, and every moment of Reynolds' aggressive behavior was laid bare for all to scrutinize. The audio was crisp, and the video captured Reynolds' confident gait as he circled the sedan, his voice rising with each threat. But then came the turning point. When Lieutenant Collins calmly requested his credentials, the sudden faltering in Reynolds' tone and the brief flash of uncertainty in his eyes were evident to everyone present. The prosecuting attorney, Mr. Thomas Greer, an advocate known for his meticulous attention to detail and fierce commitment to justice, stepped forward. Members of the court, this recording is not an isolated incident, Greer asserted. It is emblematic of a pattern of behavior, a series of abuses of power that have been documented on multiple occasions. Sergeant Reynolds, in his own duty to uphold the law, has repeatedly abused his position to intimidate civilians. Today, we present not only this recording but additional evidence from other traffic stops that reveal similar incidents of excessive force and improper threats. One by one, additional exhibits were introduced. Recordings from previous stops, statements from civilians who had experienced Reynolds' aggressive conduct, and internal memos noting complaints against him over the past few years. Each piece of evidence was meticulously authenticated. A graph was displayed showing a timeline of internal complaints alongside dates of documented incidents, clearly indicating a recurring pattern of misconduct. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a silent video recorded by another civilian in a separate encounter, where Reynolds' tone dripped with the same overconfidence and belittling language. His paroles in that video echoed the phrases he had used on that dark highway, phrases that now seemed more like threats issued by a bully than commands delivered by a law enforcement officer. As the prosecution's narrative unfolded, witnesses were called to the stand. The first to testify was an officer who had been on patrol with Reynolds on another evening, a younger officer who had long harbored doubts about his superior's methods. His testimony was measured yet candid. I recall one incident where Sergeant Reynolds aggressively confronted a motorist for a minor traffic violation. Even though his actions escalated unnecessarily, I never felt empowered to speak out at the time. Today, I regret my silence. His words, delivered with a trembling honesty, resonated with many in the courtroom who had previously feared retribution for questioning authority. Then came the testimony of civilian witnesses, individuals who bravely recounted their own encounters with Reynolds. One woman described how, on a chilly evening, she had been pulled over and subjected to a barrage of threats, her only recourse being to record the interaction on her mobile phone. Each witness reiterated the same core message. Reynolds' behavior was not only unprofessional but a violation of the trust the public placed in law enforcement. The final, and perhaps most impactful, testimony emerged when Lieutenant Sarah Collins herself was called to the stand. In a calm and measured manner that contrasted starkly with Reynolds's hoarse proclamations, she recounted that fateful encounter. "I was simply performing my duty by recording the interaction, ensuring that all exchanges were documented," she stated. "When I asked for his name, rank, and badge number, I did so because standard procedure demands clarity and accountability. I am not here to create conflict, but to preserve the integrity that every citizen expects from our system." Her voice, steady and unwavering, carried with it the weight of her esteemed background, a background that included years of service in the U.S. Army, experience in high-pressure environments, and a commitment to the truth that was beyond reproach. During cross-examination, Reynolds's defense sought to portray the events as mere misunderstandings, routine procedures blown out of proportion. His counsel argued that Reynolds was simply performing his duty, and that his aggressive language was not intended to harass but to uphold safety on the road. However, every time he attempted to justify his actions, the recorded evidence contradicted his assertions. The silence of the recordings and the unaltered facts left little room for maneuver, and his explanations grew increasingly tenuous. At one point during the trial, the courtroom fell silent as the prosecution played a clip of Reynolds's recording, highlighting the moment he declared, "I'll have you arrested for obstructing justice." The clip played again, and this time the courtroom's reaction was almost palpable. A mixture of disbelief and indignation rippled through the audience. It was a sentiment that underscored the fundamental problem. Reynolds had not just misused his authority. He had abused the trust placed in him by the community he was sworn to protect. As the day wore on and the evidence mounted, the gravity of Reynolds's actions became undeniable. The judicial process, guided by the clear, unyielding standards of law, began to dismantle the facade of unassailable power that Reynolds had so long taken pride in. Legal experts testified on the importance of maintaining accountability in law enforcement and spoke of how modern technology and transparent procedures could serve as a powerful check on authority. In what would become the turning point of the trial, a panel of expert witnesses, ranging from legal analysts to civil rights advocates, provided detailed breakdowns of the recordings and the cascading series of events that had led to this juncture. Their presentations were not filled with diatribe or personal attacks, but were instead imbued with cold, factual clarity. They explained that when a badge is wielded like a weapon of intimidation, it not only breaches the law but corrodes the very foundation of public trust. Officer Reynolds's behavior, one expert noted, illustrates that authority without accountability can easily become tyranny. By the close of the day's proceedings, it was evident that the scales of justice were poised to tip against Sergeant Michael Reynolds. Every piece of evidence, every recorded word, every voice of a civilian witness, every internal complaint, converged into a narrative of systemic abuse and personal overreach. Reynolds was left to fend for himself against a barrage of factual testimony that painted a damning portrait of a man who had overstepped his bounds time and again. As the courtroom session adjourned for the day, whispers of sympathy for the courageous witnesses mingled with the quiet murmurings of those who had once blindly trusted authority. Reynolds, now isolated and increasingly disheartened by the sheer weight of the evidence, slumped in his seat, his earlier swagger replaced by a dawning realization that his token had indeed been his undoing. The courtroom, bathed in the sober light of justice, had revealed a truth that no amount of barking threats or ego could ever hide. True authority is earned through respect, not fear, and genuine power is measured by accountability, not by the glint of a badge. The courtroom, already heavy with the weight of overwhelming evidence, fell into a respectful hush as Lieutenant Sarah Collins was called to the stand. The atmosphere was charged, not with anger or vituperation, but with a calm, steely determination that had been honed over decades of service, both in her military career and later as a civilian committed to upholding justice. As she adjusted the microphone before her, all eyes focused on her, anticipating not an outburst but a measured, evidence-driven account that would soon reveal not only the personal cost of abuse of power but also the systemic ills plaguing the department. Lieutenant Collins began her testimony by recounting the events of that fateful night over a decade ago. "I was performing my duty, recording, documenting, and ensuring that procedures were followed," she stated, her voice unhurried and resonant. I recall the chilling quiet of the night, the steady hum of the cruising patrol car, and then the abrupt intrusion of authority in the form of Sergeant Michael Reynolds, whose aggression was palpable from the moment he stepped out of his cruiser. Her tone was devoid of vitriol. Instead, it carried the weight of someone who had seen too much hardship and injustice to allow personal emotion to cloud objective judgment. With deliberate calmness, she described how she had been on assignment that night, simply collecting evidence as part of a routine civic safeguard. I did not expect confrontation. I was merely following protocol, she explained, citing the standard operating procedures that mandated recording any interaction where an officer's behavior might breach the bounds of professional conduct. She continued, "When Sergeant Reynolds demanded my credentials and began his tirade, I calmly requested his name, rank, and badge number. I merely sought to establish clear accountability, as any disciplined officer would." Her testimony then shifted from the personal to the systemic. Lieutenant Collins laid out the details of the recording. Every word of Reynolds's escalating threats, every gesture that revealed his unchecked arrogance. "This recording," she said, gesturing toward the digital evidence displayed on the courtroom screen, "shows a pattern of behavior that is not confined to one unfortunate encounter. It is, regrettably, indicative of broader issues within our police department." She pointed out that over the past few years, a series of similar incidents had been documented, and her own report had spurred other citizens to also record their interactions during traffic stops. Each recording tells a story of intimidation, excessive force, and an abuse of the very power that our badge is meant to represent. Drawing from her personal experience as a retired officer of the U.S. Army, Collins noted, "In the military, discipline and accountability are drilled into you from the moment you are commissioned. We learn that a rank or a token of authority is not a license to behave arbitrarily, but a sacred trust to act with honor." Unfortunately, in the civilian realm, especially in isolated encounters on dark roads, that very principle is sometimes forgotten. Her measured voice and the factual clarity of her words resonated deeply in the courtroom, undermining the notion that authority, when left unchecked, could render any officer untouchable. Lieutenant Collins detailed how she had witnessed other officers, in separate encounters, employing similar methods of verbal intimidation that devolved into blatant acts of harassment. "I have seen colleagues, fellow officers, who, emboldened by unchecked authority, have treated members of the public with an undue sense of superiority," she remarked. "These actions erode the public trust in law enforcement and, in the long run, compromise the entire criminal justice system." Her words were supported by statistical exhibits and internal memos released as part of the investigation, which described a series of complaints, many of which had been dismissed or inadequately addressed by superiors due to a culture of preserving the reputation of the department at all costs. She then moved into the heart of her testimony, her personal confrontation with the culture of impunity represented by Sergeant Reynolds. "I did not speak out in anger that night," Collins recalled. "I simply did my duty by recording the incident. I knew that documented facts, unadulterated by emotion, were the only way to ensure accountability. I trusted that, in time, the truth would prevail." Her eyes swept the courtroom, conveying not only the burden of those years spent watching unchecked aggression go unpunished, but also the strength that comes from adhering to truth in the face of systemic adversity. Collins further recounted the repercussions that had followed her initial report. "After that incident, I followed through with the proper channels, ensuring that my recording, along with the accompanying report, was formally submitted. I never intended to target any individual. My sole objective was to uphold the integrity of the law and to protect the dignity of the people we serve." She explained that her actions had set in motion a chain of events: an internal investigation, a Pentagon query, and ultimately, the dismantling of practices that allowed abuse of power to fester. Her testimony was methodical and laden with evidence. She referenced GPS logs from her smartphone, metadata from the recording, and internal documents that illustrated the timeline of events. Each element of evidence confirms that what transpired was not merely a clash of personalities, she emphasized. It was a failure of an entire system, one that allowed an officer to misuse his authority and, in doing so, betray the fundamental principles of public service. Her words underscored the notion that the badge, no matter how gleaming, could not shield one from the consequences of actions untempered by humility and adherence to duty. In her final remarks before concluding her testimony, Lieutenant Collins offered a powerful observation. True authority is earned by one's commitment to justice and truth, not by the power to intimidate or by the arrogance that comes from a misplaced sense of entitlement. When I asked for your name, rank, and badge number that night, it wasn't an act of challenge. It was a call for accountability. And it is this accountability, founded on evidence and procedural integrity, that is the essence of real strength. Her statement, delivered in a voice that was both compassionate and firm, carried splinters of her past military decisiveness and her hard-won experiences with systemic injustice. As her testimony drew to a close, the courtroom buzzed with a mingling of solemn respect and astonishment at the clarity of the truth. Lieutenant Collins had not only laid bare the incident involving Sergeant Reynolds. She had, with deliberate and patient candor, revealed a pervasive culture in need of reform. Her testimony was a reminder that power, stripped of responsibility, could lead to tyranny, and that only when facts are allowed to speak can justice prevail. The courtroom was bathed in a cold, determined light as the final phase of the trial commenced. After weeks of meticulous evidence, impassioned testimonies, and a relentless pursuit of accountability, the day had finally come when the fate of Sergeant Michael Reynolds would be sealed by the uncompromising power of the law. The atmosphere inside the court was heavy with anticipation. Each person in attendance, from fellow officers and media representatives to ordinary citizens curious for justice, sensed that this moment would mark the end of an era of unchecked arrogance. Presiding from the bench was Judge Amelia Foster, whose reputation for fairness and incisive judgment had been well documented through her long and distinguished career. Her posture was upright, her gaze steady as she reviewed the multitude of files before her. Evidence unambiguously captured on cameras, the testimony of Lieutenant Sarah Collins, sworn statements by civilians, and internal memos from the precinct that painted a damning portrait of systemic abuse. The trial had been as much about the fate of a single officer as it was about addressing a broader culture of arrogance within the force, a culture that had allowed power to be wielded like a weapon rather than a tool for public service. After a brief recess, during which the court had been allowed to deliberate in private, Judge Foster returned to the bench. The murmurs in the courtroom died down to an expectant hush as she prepared to deliver her verdict. With a measured tone that resonated throughout the chamber, she began. This case has been one in which the recorded evidence, corroborated by multiple witness testimonies, has left no doubt regarding the excessive use of authority and the abuse of power by Sergeant Michael Reynolds. The evidence before this court illustrates a clear pattern, a disregard for the rights of the citizens and a blatant confidence born out of a misguided belief that a badge renders one untouchable. Her eyes swept across the courtroom before she continued. You have repeatedly demonstrated behavior that not only undermines the trust placed in you as an officer of the law but also violates the very principles of respect, accountability, and due process. I remind you that rank is not an indulgence. Neither in form nor in power may it be used to intimidate or humiliate those you are sworn to protect. Her words, carved in uncompromising justice, left a palpable silence in their wake. Judge Foster then turned her attention directly to Sergeant Reynolds, whose once defiant gaze had faltered under the relentless force of documented facts. Sergeant Reynolds, you were entrusted with a responsibility, a duty to serve the public with honor and impartiality. Instead, you chose to misuse your authority, creating a climate of fear and distrust. Your actions that night, captured so clearly by Lieutenant Collins and corroborated by independent citizens, are inexcusable. The judge's voice grew firmer, each syllable a reminder of the high ethical standards demanded of law enforcement officers. The courtroom fell deeply still as the judge delivered the sentence. Based on the overwhelming evidence, it is the judgment of this court that you are hereby removed from active duty with immediate effect. Additionally, you will be subject to a full internal investigation, which will determine any further disciplinary actions, including termination and the potential revocation of your pension benefits. Let this serve as a reminder that true authority is measured not by intimidation or suppression, but by a steadfast commitment to justice and respect. With that declaration, Judge Foster's gavel came down with a resounding thud that echoed through the chamber. A symbolic end to a career once shielded by unchecked hubris. As the courtroom erupted in a mixture of subdued applause and whispered acknowledgments, the media wasted no time in capturing every detail. Photographs of the solemn face of Sergeant Reynolds, the resolute gaze of Judge Foster, and the dignified composure of Lieutenant Collins were broadcast widely, each frame telling a story of accountability conquered by truth. In that moment, the narrative that had once celebrated a badge as an inviolable token was irrevocably transformed. Reynolds's very downfall was not just the end of one man's career, it was the beginning of a wider reassessment of how power was exercised on the streets. In the corridors of the police department that very afternoon, shockwaves spread among the ranks. Some officers, especially the younger ones who had embraced the changes ushered in by digital accountability, whispered with renewed hope that this verdict signaled a turning tide. The internal investigations promised reforms, long overdue, to ensure that every subsequent encounter between law enforcement and civilians would be governed by justice, transparency, and a deep respect for human dignity. Later, as the courthouse slowly emptied and the weight of the day's verdict settled over the community, Judge Foster took a moment to reflect aloud in her final remarks, her words directed as much at the officers present as at the broader public. "Remember," she intoned solemnly, "power without accountability is tyranny. True strength does not lie in forceful threats or the glare of a badge. It emerges from the quiet courage of standing by truth, even when it is inconvenient and even when it calls for the most difficult changes." Her words lingered, a beacon of the enduring message that had propelled this entire case to its inevitable conclusion. Outside, as the light of dusk began to replace the sterility of the day, one thought resonated in the minds of all who had witnessed the proceedings. Sergeant Reynolds had thought his token made him untouchable. In the end, however, that token did nothing more than serve as a tool for Lieutenant Collins and the rule of law, to expose the truth, to restore justice, and to remind everyone that genuine power is defined by accountability and integrity. He thought he had broken her confidence, but only helped her prove the truth. Subscribe to see more stories where strength isn't the loudness of one's voice, but the steadfastness in the face of injustice.